A few months back, the Army-Navy Screen magazine went to a graduation exercise of fighting Frenchmen from a U.S. flying school in Florida. In those days, as they were waiting a little proudly for their wings, Russia had just started to hammer at Kiev, and we were just starting to mop up Sicily and the Solomons. And in those days, guys like Henri Chevenet here, orphans from a captive mother country, were hot under the collar to see action. They were itching to quit training in America and get into the fight here in England, a few short miles from home across the Channel. The tricolor of the French Republic graces many a British airstrip these days, and that means that from those airstrips every day, the Cross of Lorraine of fighting France thunders off into the east with Henri Chevenet, or René Monteur, or Jean Valcourt at the stick, or radio, or guns of the American-made Boston. They're guys from France going home. Into France, into home, past French fields sprinkled with blue cornflowers, past the green apple trees, things men remember as home. Down the cobblestone highways of the orchard country, over the old timbered houses of French towns they remember, where the Gestapo now has an office in the city hall. On to the target. French targets visited last week by Frenchmen, and the week before by Frenchmen. Suppose you were sitting in a foreign plane over Pittsburgh, or Detroit, or San Francisco, watching the bomb bays open, and watching the hell and havoc of those bombs creeping through your country, a country you wanted to go home to. You'd have to have some pretty strong convictions and value something pretty highly. France itself? No, it's the spirit of liberty for French people that's up here in this plane fighting. And it's down there, too. Don't kid yourself. It's down there strong, fighting underground, welcoming that. And that. 150 years of liberty, equality, fraternity were flying of that Allied plane. A few fighting Frenchmen died in it because they had a hankering to keep that spirit dominant in the world. So long, Frenchmen. Go on back to England. Get some more of our gas and come back home again to fight. Maybe sooner than you think you can come home and stay.
This isn't WEAF New York, or KGO Oakland, or KSL Salt Lake City. But to the guys and gals of the Fifth Army in Italy, it's Beni and Hope and Toscanini. It's the way the Army brings the touch of home to Italy. And here we go.
This is your American Expeditionary Station in the field with the Fifth Army. A radio service for American fighting men and their allies.
As this program is being performed in a Hollywood studio, a master recording is made from which transcripts will be shipped to Army and government-operated stations all over the world, strictly for you men overseas, no matter how small your outfit. And speaking of little things and trivia in general, here's old General Trivia in person. Your commanding officer of this command performance, your old sidekick, and Chief Scout of the Wolf Patrol, Bob Hope.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Howdy do, fellas. This is Bob. This is Bob, Command Performance Hope, telling each Nazi that's in Russia today that Crimea doesn't pay. I'm now getting my material from H.V. Kaltenborn.
Radio on Wheels moves to where the entertainment is. And when a songwriter and a movie star make for the front, the mobile station follows right along.
The Fifth Army American Expeditionary Station and the Special Service Section of the Fifth Army have the honor to present Irving Berlin, the cast and orchestra of his all-soldier stage hit, This Is the Army.
This is the Army, Mr. Jones. No private rooms or telephone. You had your breakfast in bed before, but you won't have it there anymore. This is the Army, Mr. Green. We like the marriage nice and clean. You had a housemaid to clean your floor, but she won't help you out anymore. Blew out the buglers come land. They're in the Army and not in a band. This is the Army, Mr. Brown. You and your baby went to town. She had you worried, but this is war, and she won't worry you anymore. More. No, she won't worry you anymore.
There's a change in fashion that shows in those Lennox Avenue clothes. Mr. Dude has disappeared with his flashy tie. You'll see in the Harlem Esquire what the well-dressed man would desire when he's strutting down the street with his sweetie pie. Suntan shade of cream or an olive drab color scheme. That's what the well-dressed man in Harlem will wear. Dressed up in ODs with a tin hat for overseas. That's what the well-dressed man in Harlem will wear. Top hat, white tie, and tails no more. They've been put away till after the war. If you want to know, take a look at Brown Bomber Joe. That's what the well-dressed man in Harlem will wear. Hold it.
Suntan,
Yes.
shade of cream,
Or an olive drab color scheme. That's what the well-dressed man in Harlem will wear. Dressed up in ODs, tin hat for overseas. That's exactly what the well-dressed man in Harlem will wear. Really like to wear a top hat. Yes, white tie and tail.
Boy,
I'm really on it. I've left this stash with the rest of the trash till after the war. See, now that
if you really
What?
want to know,
Tell me more.
take a look at the Brown Bomber.
Yes.
That's what the well-dressed man.
That's what the well-dressed man will wear.
And now a touch of beauty is added to our program by Hollywood's lovely Marlene Dietrich. Miss Dietrich, who has just recovered from a siege of pneumonia contracted here on the Italian front, has graciously joined us here to pay her respects to the Fifth Army. Here she is, lovely Miss Dietrich.
Hello, boys. I want to say that sharing this entertainment with you today is to me more important than doing the entertaining. I had hardly thought it possible that entertainment of such high caliber could be presented out here in the field. I wish to add my respect and admiration along with General Clark and Irving Berlin to the men and women of the Fifth Army. If morale is kept as high, such as I've seen during my visit here in Italy, I'm certain that we can look forward to a speedy victory. Goodbye, good luck, Godspeed.
Mr. Berlin himself will sing the song that has been inscribed for you fighting men and women of the Fifth Army.
When we were told that we were to play our show for the Fifth Army, I wrote a special song for the occasion which I am singing in the show. Now I would like to sing The Fifth Army's Where My Heart Is, and dedicate it to you, the fighting men of the Fifth Army. I met her in America about a month ago. She asked me if I'd bring her love to a certain G.I. Joe. She said when he returns, I'll be his bride. I asked her where he was, and she replied, not the first, not the second, not the third, not the fourth, but the Fifth Army's where my heart is. He's somewhere on a beachhead, which must be lots of fun. I can see him in a bathing suit, basking in the sun. From a cute signorina, he's been learning to talk like a real native of Rome. She's a very tasty dish, but my baby no capiche till the Fifth Army comes home.
June 6th is a day which will be marked in the memory of every man and woman in the world. June 6, 1944 is the day on which the United Nations flung their might against enslaved Europe and against Japan as well. For there is only one war, and no part of it is unimportant or forgotten. It is being waged in Europe, and it is being waged in the Pacific, the Aleutians, and in the furthest outposts of China, Burma, and India. It is being waged wherever a soldier or a sailor of the United Nations is on duty. For all these men are fighting together against one common enemy, the Germans and the Japanese. You know that an infantryman killing a Nazi on the bloody beaches of Normandy brings us closer to Tokyo, and that a tail gunner shooting down a Zero over New Guinea aids his buddies on the road to Berlin. Berlin or Tokyo, which was to be first? The general staffs, in planning the war, came to the decision Germany would have to be knocked out first. We knew that Hitler could survive without Japan, but Japan would have a tough time without her Nazi ally. Once Germany surrendered and the force which had been directed against her could be turned towards Japan, complete victory was inevitable. So at the Tehran Conference in November 1943, the time and place of the invasion were decided upon in principle. General Eisenhower, chosen Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, was to have full discretion to name D-Day and H-Hour. With all possible speed, he turned the meadows and cliffs of England into training grounds for thousands of British, American, and Canadian soldiers, and assembled the gigantic pile of material necessary. He brought men who had pioneered in those daring amphibious landings in the South Pacific to his headquarters, that he might profit from their experience gained at Guadalcanal and Kwajalein. During the months preceding June, the air forces of America and England pounded Europe and the invasion coast night and day. Hitler waited. Tojo waited. The world waited. General Eisenhower's men were ready.
They were ready, all right. They'd been ready for a long time. GIs and Tommies moved down to the English Channel and boarded the ugly warcraft waiting to carry them across that narrow strip of water which separates the free world from Hitler's. The power of the United Nations was gathered, ready to strike against the untested wall of Germans and steel 50 miles away. Englishmen who had seen Dunkirk looked at the mighty fleet and remembered the desperate flight from France in fishing skiffs and rowboats 4 years before. Now there were 4,000 bristling warships, heavy in the water with fighting men and the weapons of war. Things had changed. Aboard the boats, the men sweated it out, sleeping in shifts, waiting for the signal. Some of them tried to study the little invasion books on France and keep their minds off what lay ahead. Some of them read comic books, or the Bible, or whatever they could get their hands on. Anything to make the heavy hours pass more quickly. Men cooked what might be their last hot meal for days to come and stuffed it down and laughed. While they waited, none of them looked or acted like guys on whose shoulders rested the most tremendous responsibility in modern history. But that was the general idea. They were waiting for the signal which would mean the beginning of the end of Hitler. And then, on June 5th, from the bridges of 4,000 ships, the signal came. Eisenhower had said go. The invasion fleets silently moved out of the English harbors and pointed their prows toward the Normandy coastline. The day had come. But before one landing barge of that vast sea armada touched the shore of France, these gliders, packed with airborne fighters, would have landed behind the Atlantic Wall. Before dawn tomorrow, these men would be gnawing at their rations in foxholes. Before dawn, these motorbikes would be kicking up dust miles inland from the beaches. Before dawn, this Vickers 303 would be spitting slugs at a startled German garrison. And with luck, this TNT would be wrapped around the trestle of a French bridge. With luck, these bullets would be carving out a path for the invasion. Pack 'em tight, soldier. Check your weapons like you'll never check them before. If they don't work right tonight, you won't be able to complain to the supply sergeant tomorrow. When the sun goes down, you're beginning the invasion of Europe. The stuff went into the bellies of the big gliders. The metal of the guns was cold. By dawn, it would be hot, or shot to hell. Barber, laundryman, errand boy, clerk, respectively. He was a bus driver. Now they were soldiers, paratroopers. Once Hitler had claimed that democracy is too weak to produce fighting men. He counted on it. Here in the twilight of June 5th was his answer. They listened professionally to the briefing. Bridges, roads, airfields, command posts. 5 miles inland, 20 miles inland. They listened to perilous missions for guys who'd volunteered for perilous missions. They were the spearhead of the world's mightiest attack, but they grinned with the confidence of men who know what to do. As the light waned, it was time. General Brereton of the 9th Air Force was there to see some of them go as they clambered awkwardly into the plains. Leading the attack were the guys of the 82nd Division, who had cut their battle teeth in Sicily and on the hot beaches at Salerno. With them were men of the 101st, with whom they trained in England. They climbed in, and they were ready. Airfields all over England came the roar of the C-47s of the 9th Air Force as they took off into the night. Their passengers had an appointment in France. Every man in the invasion that night thought of General Eisenhower's order of the day. Soldiers, sailors, airmen, you're about to embark on a great crusade. The eyes of the world are upon you, and the hopes and the prayers of all liberty-loving people go with you. Now, led by the RAF, wave after wave, marauders and libs swept in for a final smashing of the German coastal defenses. strung out across the channel, the invasion fleet steamed relentlessly toward its objective, a 50-mile strip of French coastline. Overhead, planes, heavy with the bombs which were blasting the Atlantic Wall, together with the shells of the Navy, saw the fleet moving in. H hour was at hand. This was it. There was France. This was Normandy on June 6, 1944. Dead lay on the beaches. In the shelter of the cliffs, they cared for wounded as best they could. Every death or wound that day was history, whether it was an invader or the Heron folk, the men who set out to conquer the world. The look in the eyes of the men who had seen us crack their Atlantic wall was history. We were in France. And offshore, there was history, too. The 4 stars meant I could come over. Eisenhower of Kansas, USA, in whose strong hands lay the destiny of free people. There was history when Omar Bradley, commander of every American on the beachheads, clambered up the side to talk shop with the boss. When they talked, his story was pretty proud. There was history when the ground force commander was piped aboard. Monty of El Alamein, Montgomery of Britain, whose men were once more facing the Rommel they had licked in Africa. The skill of these men was making history no nation in the world would ever stop remembering. At perhaps the same moment, on a dusty windowsill in a city 1,000 miles from Normandy, another general had carved his name indelibly into the historic pages of June 6, 1944. Mark Clark and his 5th Army were in Rome. This is Rome, 3 days before June 6th. Those are Germans, licked, running from the historic capital where for over a year they had been protecting fascism with their guns and Gestapo. Take a look at Germany, moving out. Then take a look at the United Nations, moving in next day. Rome, the legendary ancient capital which 3,000 years of conquerors had dreamed of capturing. Rome, with American men and armor pouring into its outskirts. When Hitler conquered Paris, he dressed up his supermen and shined their boots. Not here. These aren't supermen and don't want to be. These are just a tired bunch of sweaty soap salesmen and ball players and high school kids from Indiana and New Mexico, chewing double mint, pushing slowly past the shadows of the Colosseum and the monuments of ancient Rome in a weary route step. But instead of drums and the triumph of conquerors, they brought along some Scotchmen and their bagpipes. They made American wisecracks the Italians didn't understand. Those PFCs and T4s and lieutenants of Mark Clark's victorious Fifth Army weren't proud goose-stepping conquerors. The conquerors, the goose-stepping men, had forced a worldwide war, a war that had sent skinny and fat and ordinary Americans scattering into dirt and homesickness, from the jungles of New Guinea to the coast of France. No, these Americans wanted only to unconquer and then go home. Their triumph on June 6, 1944, was in the faces of the people of Rome. Those faces were of people who were tired of being afraid. People standing on the streets and laughing. Some of them made speeches. Some went around tearing down reminders of German occupation. They streamed in and out of the wide squares of the old city and waved at the Americans and yelled, "Viva gli Americani!" In Rome, by June 6, 1944, liberation was more than a word. These faces are facts about why we're fighting a war. Scores of thousands of Italian people pushed into the historic square before St. Peter's for the Pope's blessing. The Pope thanked God, and the people bowed their heads. Allied arms and blood and gunpowder had brought them freedom from fascism. When the prayer was through, they cheered again. They could cheer. For the first time in 22 years, they would be free to vote and elect themselves to govern themselves. Like a bell in Philadelphia in 1776, the bells of Rome rang out on June 6, 1944. And on the other side of Europe, in a simple French village named Saint-Marcouf, the bells of Normandy joined those of Rome. The simple human right of liberty walked in behind some GIs in dirty fatigues, and a scattered handful of French farmers and their wives and kids talked to the Americans with their hands and said thanks. A half-mile away from this liberated street in France, Americans were fighting and getting killed, as they were 1,000 miles away and 2 oceans away. In Normandy, in Italy, in Burma, on the seas, the democracies were fighting so that handful of free men in Normandy, 6, would grow and reach across the world, and there would be peace. It's one war. No part of it is unimportant or forgotten.
Is a little out of the way, so you keep a sharp eye for that turn-off signpost. And after you make the turn, you go through Weed Patch. That's right, Weed Patch. Then comes Arvin, California, a typical western small town. Looks about the same now as it did before the war. Nice, normal bunch of folks. It was just before the Christmas mailing deadline, and the post office was the busiest spot in town. Just about everybody was sending a gift somewhere. To the young fellows from Arvin. All over the world now. Over in a corner, sorting out her share of the mail to be delivered, is Effie Mahan. Quite a lady, Effie. She's been hauling all kinds of mail in all kinds of weather for 16 years. Since the war, she loves to see the V-mail come in and honks her horn like a kid in a jalopy when she delivers any. Because Effie knows that mail from overseas is going to do double duty before she's finished with it. Effie got the idea more than a year ago, over at the Red Cross, while she and Mrs. Bonesteel were rolling bandages. She was relaying some of the news about the men overseas that she'd picked up from families on her route. And Mrs. Bonesteel said she knew her son in the South Pacific
would like to hear about the other fellows from Marvin. Well, pretty soon all the news about men in uniform that Effie could collect was in a special issue of the town's weekly paper and mailed to every last man from Marvin. Effie got quite a kick out of the letters of appreciation that came in from those APOs, so she's hard at it again for a second year. There's more than mail traveling with Effie. There's a scratch pad and a pencil, so she can jot down everything that might be of interest to the men from Marvin, wherever they are. About passing the Rock Pile School, for instance, and seeing the youngsters at play during recess. And of the three mothers at her first stop, waiting for news from their sons. Mrs. Woods, with 2 in the Marines and 1 in the Navy. Mrs. Stambaugh, mother of a gunner on a B-29 in India. And Mrs. Garrett, with a Navy son in the South Pacific. Plenty of news here for that special issue of the paper. There's more than people to be written about, like the new fields of Waiuli that most of the men have never seen. In 3 more years, this crop will be harvested for synthetic rubber. And Effie writes of the cotton fields along her route, and the ladies and the kids, and the old men doing the picking. She writes of the kids running to meet her for the mail that didn't come, just like she saw the men from Marvin do so long ago. And how the faces of Mr. and Mrs. Long light up when she bangs on the horn to announce mail from their 2 sons, somewhere in the ETO. A letter from either one of the Long boys means more news for reporter Effie. It's been a little tough on the Longs, running their farm without the boys, but the mail is a powerful tonic. At Martha Wilson's place, Effie sees that monthly get-together of the young wives whose husbands are away. Always a jackpot for Effie here, because the girls get together to exchange news of their men and snapshots from far-off places. And if Corporal Wilson of the 9th Air Force is looking, here's that youngest one you haven't seen. Later, these kids will be cared for by one mother, while the others go to Bakersfield for their 1 movie a month. Civilian-style rotation. Down the road a bit, Mrs. Lister is waiting with a package for her son in the Pacific. And Johanna McBride isn't forgetting her Navy brother. And down at the camp where the Mexican nationals come in to help the Americans harvest the crops, there's quite a bit of mail addressed to Americans overseas. Like the husband of Ramona Martinez, who sent her his Purple Heart from a hospital in England. Effie writes that her sale of war stamps and bonds is very good here. And in her report to the men from Marvin, Effie tells of the solid truckloads of people leaving the DeGiorgio packing plant in the morning, heading for the vineyards. Women mostly, and men brought in from Mexico. Some of the grapes are already picked and are drying in papers on the ground. Just about everybody works in the vineyards at the peak of the crop. Eleanor Sue Jones is a college girl, a little proud of the dust and sweat of the vineyards. Henrietta Culture is another one of the many volunteers from the AWBS, with a sister in the Red Cross in Italy. It's a 9-hour day for the gals, 6 days a week, and the entire crop goes to the Army. The raisins, Joe, not the ladies. In the big DeGiorgio packing house, the women are supervised by Mrs. Dolly Workman, who often gives Effie news about her 2 brothers in the Marines and the 1 in the Navy. And Effie has a woman's pride about her friend Mrs. Bryant, who stayed on the job the day she learned that one of her boys was lost in Africa. Rex Davis is a quiet young fellow, discharged from the Navy with a Purple Heart and a Presidential Unit Citation. And his co-workers don't even know he's ever been in uniform. Collecting the news and jotting down her impressions while she delivers the mail makes a pretty long day for Effie, but she loves it. She tells the men of the Milo maize crop, good heavy feed, and the sight of Bear Mountain from the highway, and the huge crop of potatoes stored in the new warehouses built this year, and the new bank that finally made Arvin feel like a city. Finally, Effie goes to the little plant of the weekly paper, the Arvin Tiller, and turns over all her news to the publisher, printer, business manager, editor, and linotype operator, Mr. Reed. And in a couple of days, a special issue is coming off the press, ready to be mailed all over the world to men who want to know every last thing there is to know about their hometown and their people and their pals who are fighting on other fronts. Effie has a little thought for the men away from home. She realizes that a letter from home can mean everything to them, but she wishes they could see the faces of the mothers, the wives, the fathers, the youngsters, when a letter reaches home from a man overseas. It's enough to put a lump in your throat, even after you've been delivering good news and bad for 16 years. Well, that's the story of the lady from Marvin.
This is one of the happiest days in the lives of these half-starved men marching along a road in the Philippines. They are ending 3 years of imprisonment in the Japanese stockade at Cabanatuan. Nearly all of them are veterans of our first Philippine campaign. Some of them are survivors of the monstrous death march that followed the surrender of Corregidor. Let them speak for themselves.
This is my buddy, Don Smith.
Don Smith, happy to know you, Don.
Right.
Where are you from?
Boulder, Colorado.
Boulder, Colorado?
Right.
And you?
Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, as I understand it, why both you fellas were forced to make the death march after you were captured?
That's right.
Well, now, how did that start out? Would you tell me a little bit about it?
Well, after the surrender, we stayed in the sun for about a day and a half, and then we started marching to San Fernando. That was our goal. We marched for 3 days and 3 nights, and, well, the bad part about it, we didn't have no food or water, and only water we could get was Upper Carabao Wallers and drainage ditches and stuff like that. And even though the Filipinos tried to give us food, the Japanese wouldn't let them, and several times they bayoneted women and children trying to give us water and food. But then we finally made it, thank God, and that was about, from there on we was transported to a prison camp in boxcars.
How many men do you suppose you lost? Do you have any idea while you were on this march?
Well, I'd say we lost about, on the group I was in, there was 800 men. I'd say we lost about 150.
150 out of the 800?
Mm-hmm. They fell out of line and they were bayoneted, most of them.
I see. And how much weight did you lose? Do you have any idea at all?
Well, I was weighing about 160, and when I arrived at camp, I was weighing about 118.
118. Lost that much in the 3 days and nights. Hot sun, I suppose, all the time.
Hot sun, no water, and fatigue, and that's what made me lose the weight, I suppose.
Sergeant Donald Smith.
What did you consider to be the worst feature of the whole 3-day march?
Well, it just seems so many of my friends, that is, that couldn't make it.
When they couldn't make it, they were killed?
Yes. And if you fell out and tried to help any of them, why, you received the same treatment. So not so many of them got away with it.
Did the Japanese do anything to you personally as far as torture?
Well, no, not exactly. Just usual run-of-the-mill stuff. You were beaten for almost any little thing. Especially out on the farm, one of the Japs worked me over a little bit with a pick handle, but outside of that,
What had been the cause of that?
Well, it was someone clear down in another little plot of ground that was working. He was standing up stargazing or something, and they had their little tricks like that. They'd pick on the first one handy rather than walk the length of the plot to go get someone else.
So you took the punishment for someone else because the Jap was lazy, is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
Private First Class Pat Parker.
Would you mind telling me how the Japs persuaded you in case you didn't feel too strong or didn't want to work that day?
Well, that'd be simple. Pick handles.
Pick handles?
That's right.
By just hitting a man with a pick handle.
Well, not only hitting, they beat. If
Beat.
you knock you down, they'd stomp you and kick you around.
Well, now, what did you weigh when you were captured? You happen to remember that?
I weighed 183 pounds.
And what was the lowest weight you hit after you were down? You might say down to the low ebb.
Well, that was Nichols Field. I got down to 75 pounds.
From 183 pounds,
That's
clear
right.
down to 75.
Right.
Now, one other thing. Did the Japs ever torture you any or anything like that? Or would you mind mentioning a
Well,
case or so?
Yes, one case they do a little torturing. I got hung up by the thumb once.
By the thumbs?
That's right.
Are there any scars on them there? Well, how did that work? How did the whole torture go? Or what was the cause of it? And what did they do? And how long was it?
Well, they caught me talking to a Filipino girl. Well, the last I seen her, they beat her to death. Well, they beat me a while and then hung me up with the thumbs. I hung out there 72 hours.
Without food or water?
Without food or water.
To make it worse, why, they set a pitcher of water out in front of us. And then about every 30 minutes, they'd come along and drop a piece of ice in it. That was pretty hard to take.
Yeah, I'll bet. Did you finally pass out, or did you keep conscious all the time?
Well, I stayed conscious all the time, but I couldn't stand alone when they took me down.
They owe their liberty to a company of rangers who marched into enemy territory, annihilated the Japanese garrison at Cabanatuan, and brought the 512 prisoners back through enemy lines. 3 years of imprisonment, starvation, and hell stand between them and the last time they walked as free men or tasted an American cigarette. Sergeant Robert Fell.
I'm a Britisher that was liberated from that prison camp. I was taken prisoner in Singapore, from where I was sent to Thailand and compelled to help build a railway, during which time at least 50% of the people that were sent there died of cholera, dysentery, diphtheria, and malnutrition. From Thailand, I returned to Singapore and was embarked on board a Japanese ship which was to take us to Japan. Off the coast of Luzon, this ship was sunk by American dive bombers. Of the 1,300 aboard, to my knowledge, only 70 of us survived. From there, after swimming ashore, I was taken to this prison camp number 1, and I was liberated by the Yanks when they came in. I'm glad to be back in civilization again.
Sergeant Samuel Goldie, Signal Corps.
Rangers came in that night, and it was about as happy a sight I'd ever seen in my life. For 3 years, we couldn't do anything without someone telling us what to do, and now at last we can do what we want when we want to. I'll be sure glad to get back to the United States, where I'll be a free American again.
I'm from the 101st Airborne Infantry, the Screaming Eagle Division. The Army-Navy Screen Magazine have asked me to sit in on a film they're making about Bastogne. I guess I'm supposed to tell you what it was like up there in Belgium during the big German winter offensive, their last offensive of this war. As small as the Bastogne pocket was, it's impossible for a guy like me to tell you the entire story. And the films we have just aren't enough. You see, the cameramen were so busy at the time, banging away with their carbines and their M1s, that they just couldn't film everything. But anyhow, let's have a look at it. Okay, let it go. We moved into it from a rest area in France, where we were getting re-equipped after a long campaign up in Holland. I think the code orders to Brigadier General Tony McAuliffe, that's him, were something like, get the Screaming Eagles to Merry Christmas. I don't have to tell you how it feels to get tossed out of a nice warm sack. They issued us some of the equipment we'd need for a combat jump, but no parachutes. When they didn't give us the canopies, we knew we were tagged for something special. And brother, we were. That very same afternoon, they loaded us into the 6x6s. After the kidding stopped, we began to wonder where we were going. Some of the boys had it that we were going to be landed in Norway, or be moved back to the States, or jump on Japan. All that night, our pants polished those hard wooden seats. Then, we heard the straight dope, about to break through. Hal von Rundstedt's December counteroffensive had broken through the Ardennes front for 75 miles, from Aachen to the Saar. Heard Merry Christmas on headquarters map was Bastogne, the road hub. As long as we could hold on to Bastogne, we could screw up the German offensive. That was the angle. First, we moved the Belgians back. No sense them getting hurt. They were a lot like the farmers I knew upstate in Pennsylvania. It was pretty tough to move these people back just before Christmas, after they'd been liberated once. But Christmas around Bastogne didn't look too cheerful for us either. We didn't know who was friend or enemy. Some Germans were wearing our uniforms, so we had to search everyone. Then we really got a jab. It became a white Christmas. Most of us had left our overcoats back in the rest area. We didn't even warm up when the battle started, and it was hot. Lots of fellows got it right away. See that guy? Bobby Leaking. With his M1 and 2 grenades, he knocked out a machine gun position and a Jerry patrol. And after he caught a pack of slugs in his leg, he took care of a burp gunner. That's the way it was all around the rim the week before Christmas. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. We lost damn near everything. Our quartermaster unit, our ordnance, tanks, trucks, and more important, a lot of good guys. The casualty list in some platoons sound like the roll call. They froze in the snow where they got it. Culbreth, Harmon, Heitzman, McGregor, Newton, Parks, Merritts, a lot of good men. But our 1 division was holding off 8 full German divisions. Yet no matter how tough things get, there are always some GIs who can make with the humor. A couple of them dreamed up a title for us, The Battered Bastards of the Bastion of Bastogne. We laughed and kept hammering away with what little ammo we had left. Then on Friday, Black Friday, the Germans made one of their biggest mistakes. They sent us an ultimatum. Surrender or be annihilated by artillery. 2 hours to answer. General McAuliffe answered with 1 4-letter word. He wrote to the German commander, nuts. One of the boys had to explain the meaning to the Kraut commandant. He stated it was just GI American or go to hell. The Krauts answered our 4-letter word with one of their own. Fire. They poured it on. 88s and screaming Mimis. So we hung on to Bastogne, sweating out an ammo shortage, knowing our only break could be an airborne resupply mission. But the overcast was so thick, a troop carrier plane couldn't get through with a snowplow. Let me tell you, we really sweated. With no weather break expected until New Year's Eve, more than a week away. Hell, by that time, we'd be throwing snowballs at charity. All we could do was hold on and pray. And we prayed. We prayed for a sunrise. We prayed for the skies to open. And on Saturday morning, the day before Christmas Eve, the sun came up. The most terrific sunrise of the war. And in the sunlight were the C-47 Sky trains. Sky full of Douglas Dakotas and Waco gliders as far as you could see.
Tug to Herman, no motor. Goodbye, Herman. Okay, Flash. So long.
Look at them, the guys of the 9th Troop Carrier Command, barreling right through the flak and ground fire. Coming in so low over the German lines, we started joking about giving them combat infantry badges to wear over their wings. Jerry is pushing up plenty of flak, and there are plenty of flamers, yet those hot rocks keep coming in, without armor or fighter cover. From the bellies of the steel geese pour the ammo, the rations, the guns, the shells, and all the other stuff we need for our fight. Gliders, more supplies, and medics, surgical teams. Those glider pilots, brother, they're the guts and glory boys. After bringing in their glue and fabric crates, they jumped out, grabbed guns, and got in a line with the rest of us, for the 1,500 tons of stuff the 9th Troop Carrier Command brought us in time for Christmas. So Christmas Eve, we tossed a party. We let the Krauts come in close, let them think their tanks had cleared the way. Then we opened up. It was really a surprise party. You could hear them hollering comrade, begging for mercy, asking for a break. Oh, sure. We gave them a break, the kind they'd been giving everybody else. We broke them. all the way down. And when we nailed them wearing civilian and GI clothes, we took good care of them, too. The German supermen. They didn't know what the hell had happened. They thought they had us holed in, but the hole turned inside out. Their great counteroffensive wound up inside our prisoner of war cages. That was the way the Battle of Bastogne ended, in the last German offensive of the war. After the 4th Armored rolled in, we began to attack. A month later, the mission was completed, and we Screaming Eagles marched out. As you know, we got a presidential vision.
The citation. These units distinguished themselves in combat against powerful and aggressive enemy forces composed of elements of 8 German divisions during the period of 18th December to 27th December 1944 by extraordinary heroism and gallantry in defense of the key communication center of Bastogne, Belgium.
When General Eisenhower pinned a picture frame on us, I was thinking about the other guys who came to Bastogne, and I'm sure that most of the other troopers in the 101st were thinking the same thing. Now, this isn't official, through channels, but I've asked the Army-Navy Screen magazine to show you their pictures. Here are the guys who saved our torn and tattered airborne backs. The Hot Rocks of the 9th Troop Carrier Command. That's Major General Paul L. Williams. He's the commanding general. The outfit has carried every airborne show in the ETO. Pilots, co-pilots, and navigators, like Colonel Joe Crouch, Scott, Montgomery, Hines, Berman. Crew chiefs and radio operators, Adler, Reynolds, McJunkin, Martin, and the glider pilots, those are my boys, Simpson, Oliver, and Connors. If you ever run into any of these 9th Troop Carrier guys, buy them a drink for the Screaming Eagle. They really paid for it at Bastogne, in the battle in which we all fought. It was plenty rugged.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God. The issue of this war is the basic issue between those who believe in mankind and those who do not. The ancient issue between those who put their faith in the people and those who put their faith in dictators and tyrants. There have always been those who did not believe in the people, who attempted to block their forward movement across history, to force them back to servility and suffering and silence. The people have now gathered their strength. They are moving forward in their might and power, and no force, no combination of forces, no trickery, deceit, or violence can stop them now. They see before them the hope of the world, a decent, secure, peaceful life for men everywhere.
Peace can endure only so long as humanity really insists upon it and is willing to work for it and sacrifice for it. 25 years ago, American fighting men looked to the statesmen of the world to furnish the work of peace for which they fought and suffered. We failed them. We failed them then. We cannot fail them again and expect the world to survive again.
let us, all of us, have confidence. Let us redouble our efforts. A tremendous, costly, long-enduring task in peace as well as in war is still ahead of us. But as we face that continuing task, we may know that the state of this nation is good. The heart of this nation is sound. The spirit of this nation is strong. The faith of this nation is eternal.
This is the Rhineland city of Cologne, spring 1930. Brisk commerce from France and Belgium and Holland, from the rich Rhineland cities, was flowing through its mammoth station and past it on the river. Cologne was the thriving gateway to Germany, a busy, useful city of 750,000 Germans just beginning to recover from their First World War. That was 15 years ago. A couple of years before this sweating Caesar was voted into power with his high promises, some of which history proved bitterly true. For as spring came to the Rhine in 1945, this was Cologne under Hitler. There was no city anymore. History had run over it with the weight of the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. First Army and left this hollow collection of rubble and stone as testament. Germany had brought this to herself. This is defeat in modern war. The sound of ruin is silence. The smell of ruin is sick with the scent of dead and dust. And it is no longer a city. Like 100 other ruined German cities, its sidewalks and streets are stone piles. Car tracks and street lamps and buses are twisted and grotesque. The homes and the people in the homes are gone. There are no theaters or restaurants or banks or stores. No light, no sewers, no water, no phone, no city as we know a city. There is only destruction by war. But this is a story of the rebuilding of that city from its rubble. These are the men who came to do it, soldiers of MG, G5, the American military government, to whom has fallen the battle of the peace. And as the stars and stripes go up, this is the first beginning of that vast occupation army which is clearing up the rubble of a nation today. The men whose dirty, thankless job it is to build a city out of chaos, and do it quickly and with justice to its citizens. Colonel and lieutenant and PFC alike, they are engineers and lawyers, clerks and cops, specially trained to know this city and how it once worked. They're soldiers for the battle of the peace. Their job is tough because it's more than a physical rebuilding of a ruined place. It's here, too, in the people. In weary files, the citizens who'd fought a war to win the world come home across American bridges. And MG must take responsibility for their life. A bum life, which needs a first-class overhaul. The Germans listen respectfully, as Germans would, while an MG announcer gives them their first American orders. They look like any well-fed people in a city street. They're not. They're German. Inside, they're sick and bitter over another German war they didn't win. And to a people like these, it's MG's job to show the way to a democratic kind of life. It was a double job, the city and its German people. And Germans had been infected a long, long time. DDT killed lice on the bodies of Germans, all of whom MG had ordered to take the treatment. DDT stopped a sweeping typhus epidemic. But it was just one part of the double job. The powder couldn't reach their minds and kill out the infection of their former life. Here's a German with that infection burned into his arm. That's the blood type mark, used only for SS men, tattooed on his skin for life, as his SS ideas are in his brain for life. He is incurable. It was to catch men like him that MG ordered each German to be stopped and asked for papers. The penalty for not reporting in for screening within 24 hours was severe. In long columns, the new arrivals waited on the streets for interviews. And it would be from them, the fat ones or the thin ones, the butcher and the brewmaster, that MG would have to choose the men who would rebuild and run their ruined city. Confirmed and dangerous Nazis mixed in the crowd. They had to. Side by side with them stood anti-Nazis coming home from exile. And as the MG questionnaires were filled out, the questions asked and answered, it became apparent that some of the most vicious of them had once been key men in the city. Some of the best were inexperienced. It would be the skill and honesty of MG in weeding out the bad right here, which would determine whether Germany would ever go to war again or not. The responsibility was heavy. What Nazi organizations did you join, mein Herr? What's been your source of income, mein Frau? Did you fight the Nazis? If so, how? The job was tough, and the Germans cynical. But very slowly, in the swelling files, trustworthy records began to show up. And from them, MG selected its first police force. Here, an MG interpreter explains its basic functions. Policing the broken streets from looting, from sabotage. And MG's first emblems of trust went out to Germans of Cologne. Armbands for the vanguard of the Germans who would work our way against the Nazi infection. There were others, many others. This distinguished-looking German had been head of the Prussian Senate, famous as a city planner and as a foe of fascism. Yes, there were decent Germans to help MG. Germans to guide other Germans to democratic life. It was the beginning of the peace. As the old went out, in came the new. The end of lies, the beginning of truth. The end of tyranny, the beginnings of a new chance. These were MG's terms of conquest. The rules were tough. They had to be, for the job was tough. And then the job began. There was still no city of Cologne. The hollow buildings menaced Germans and Americans alike. MG's newly restaffed fire department helped, as down they came one by one, until the ruin of the city was complete, and building could begin again, stone by stone. It was a dirty job, those first months of cleaning up, so MG gave the dirty work to Germans used to dirty work, the Nazis. For the Nazis, whether banker, lawyer, government official, or party gangster, could not be trusted with any other type of work. So this was their job. No matter how much they whined, they couldn't do it. It was MG's double overhaul, the city and the people. MG made it clear to Nazi gripers that if they didn't work, they didn't eat. For one of the most crucial problems of the wrecked city was food. Already 150,000 Germans had come back, and what food came in wasn't enough to feed 30,000. MG's job was not to feed them. It was merely to make sure it was distributed and kept from the black markets. MG told the Germans, feed yourself. And Germans did. They had to. Young Germans and old ones, girls and their grandmothers went to work in the fields outside the city. The era of starving other nations to feed Germany was gone. The era of using Polish, Russian, Serbian, and French men and women as slaves in the fields was gone. Some of the former slaves weren't gone, and the MG ration system obliged Germans to feed the displaced persons free. It used the same points the Germans had used in Nazi times, but instead of feeding Nazis first, it fed them last. Instead of feeding anti-Nazis last or not at all, it fed them first. The points would bring little. There was little food. and first priority went to the sick and wounded in the hospitals. This big new building had been Cologne's best hospital, assigned by MG to take care of Allied wounded. This one, second least harmed by battle, went to displaced persons, to all whom the Nazis tortured and enslaved or starved, like this Polish woman. The other hospitals, bombed and wrecked, went to sick German citizens, and MG ordered them to isolate their typhus cases in them quickly. MG had no medical supplies to spare the Germans, hardly enough for the anti-Nazi sick. So the wrecked drugstores of the city were stripped, under strict MG supervision, for drugs and medicines with which Germans could minister unto themselves. Slowly and painfully, Cologne was beginning to be a city again. One by one, as MG directed, the citizens brought its 1,000,001 functions slowly back to operation. One by one, the water mains and sewer pipes and power cables and communication systems and streetcar tracks began to operate again, as the Germans repaired the devastation which their war had brought to them. This had been a submarine cable underneath the Rhine, hidden from MG by Nazis, but revealed by the new Germans, the Germans willing to accept our peace. Above the ground, the twisted poles and broken wires which had been blasted out of service were patched and repaired so the city could have light. And though only Allied officials could use the phone, the switchboards were rewired and put to work with German operators. From the mines beyond Cologne, coal began to come again. But its destination was not German homes and stoves, for there was just enough coal coming from the earth to feed the giant generators of the city. Coal for generators which supplied power to nearby Holland and Belgium, and paid back a tiny amount of Germany's huge war debt to those nations. These are coal briquettes for furnaces, a fraction of what was needed, but all there was. In and beyond the city was the desperate snarl of transportation. The few engines and freight cars not wrecked were overtaxed beyond belief, and shipping on the river helped but little. MG's airtight priority system had to be set up and enforced to move the endless supplies the city needed. Even worse were the knotty problems of finance. Here, a banker from Wisconsin explained MG policy to a group of pre-Hitler bankers from Cologne. Black markets, price control, the occupation mark, inflation. As trusted Germans dug German cash from the ruined vaults, MG's job in finance was just beginning too. Physically, MG's first steps in recreating a city had begun all at once, all together. As the Nazis cleared away the rubble here, the streetcar line began to work again there. And elsewhere, a baker found new flour to make his bread. Slow, tedious, unimpressive work. But as each edition of the Army's German-language newspaper hit the street, it talked of the rebuilding life of the city, the things inside the Germans, the other part of MG's double job. 500,000 Germans read it every day. Though they suspected it as propaganda, they could look around and see what it talked about, see what the propaganda meant, see what MG had already done. They could see Corpus Christi celebrated in front of their exquisite cathedral for the first time in 14 years. MG's doing. The Battle of the Peace. They could see Jewish people standing again in their temples. Buildings ruined not by war, but by the Nazis. They could see human beings raised again to honor and citizenship and freedom of religion under God. The things Americans had died in battle to bring back. The things MG was bringing back. The Battle of the Peace. They could see a new marble monument in a Cologne park, a monument to German dead. It was to German heroes of this war, and the inscription which they read ran like this: "This is to commemorate Germany's most shameful years, 1933 to 1945. The heroes were Germans killed by Nazis in Belsen concentration camp, and their heroism had been believing against fascism and war. In dedication and in shame before it stood the Germans of tomorrow, some still in the garb of concentration camps, They were Germans who knew Germany's shame, who wanted the chance MG offered them to earn their future and wipe out the remnants of that shame. It was those remnants which MG's open courts were vigorously prosecuting. Any and all Germans who even slightly stood in the path of the rebuilding of the city. That was part of the overhaul. Behind the bench were 3 MG officers, American lawyers. Before them every day came the parade of black marketers, Nazi diehards, petty crooks, the Germans who sabotaged the peace. This day, the German had been caught packing a gun. This gun, an Army Luger. This is the German sweating out a phony alibi. These are his lawyers, whom MG permitted to practice in its courts, provided they had never been Nazis. Here, the interpreter was a German who'd come to America when the Nazis took over Germany. Part of the procedure was the rule that testimony and the statements of the judges must be translated, so the audience can hear and understand that justice, unlike Nazi law, can be just as well as tough. Now a U.S. citizen, the sergeant is helping show this to Nazis he had hated. The verdict was guilty, the sentence hard. Germans convicted in the courts were sent here, the grimmest building in the city. This is Klingelputz, the forbidding former Gestapo prison and torture house, curiously untouched by war. But as MG's prisoners climbed down in front of Klingelputz, suddenly the immensity of MG's job in this or any German city is symbolized by another prisoner, a cocky little Aryan Superman. Like thousands of his countrymen, he was still infected. That's the point. He wasn't even being hypocritical or trying to pretend that he was cured. He showed off, still a 2-bit big shot in his own mind, even here in prison under MG guard, and with a decent, respected German questioning him. He was still a Nazi, and always would be. Suppose MG hadn't caught him and kicked him into jail. And instead, he and his kind were free to wander through the city, working their cynicism against the future of these German kids. Suppose that instead of this MG welfare center, nothing stood as sentinel against filling these little towheads full of Nazi arrogance again, and the rumbling of German war drums for revenge. Then we would lose the battle of the peace, not only in this city and its people, but in the world. For it's here, with German children who are too young to remember, sitting in the sun, that you can hear the sound of German future and the future of us all. The dirty rubble of defeat, the aftermath of a war their German parents brought them. These German boys had 2 things burning brightly in their future. 1, it is they who will inherit the day of the atomic bomb, when another war would end the world. 2, in the bonfires MG has started for them, to burn out the infection of their past, lies their only chance. It's MG's fight to the finish. It's MG's battle of the peace. Without it, would the war be finally won? Suddenly, the guns stopped firing, and there was peace. On a muddy-colored day in September 1945, in a city called Tokyo, an American flag which had been made by machines in Camden, New Jersey, rose slowly into the Japanese air, and there was peace. And this is what it looked like. This is how it was that day when history turned the corner into the future, down a Tokyo street, and the world was at peace, perhaps forever. The Japanese soldier, defeated and disarmed, returned to a homeland stripped of its power and will to make war. Here was testimony to the effectiveness of our Superfort incendiary raids. Yokohama, razed and seared by the fire bombs. Tokyo, 80% destroyed, 100,000 dead. antiquated hand pump firefighting apparatus was proof that the Jap had not believed it possible. It was possible, but it would take a long, long time to convince Japan of its defeat. A long-range educational program using the press, radio, motion picture, and school facilities was designed to convince the Japs of the Empire's war guilt and to foster peaceful and democratic processes in the defeated country. For these people, men, women, and children, the die was cast. American planes buzzed Tokyo, winging over the Imperial Palace, reminding its heaven-born tenant who was boss. Below, Japs bowed with reverence before their unseen emperor, who was now taking orders from Washington, D.C., USA. Emperor Hirohito, 124th of his line, supreme power in Japan, until General MacArthur took over the reins. In these films from another day, General Hideki Tojo rode behind the Mikado in pompous display. At a Yokohama hospital on September 11th, Tojo lay near death after shooting himself with an American pistol. The blood of a Yank sergeant helped save the ex-premier for trial as #1 war criminal. Tojo ordered the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. His deed came back to haunt him less than 4 years later in a blast of atomic energy which roared the final death note for all Japanese militarists. Smoke rose 50,000 feet. An explosion equal to 20,000 tons of TNT brought the greatest man-made disaster in the history of the world. This was Hiroshima. The first atomic bombing of August 6th completely leveled 4 square miles, constituting 60% of the city. Nagasaki, where the Strategic Air Forces loosed a second atomic bomb on August 9th. 18,000 of the city's 50,000 houses and buildings were destroyed, including the vaunted Mitsubishi Steel Foundry. It was the beginning of the end. The Allied fleet, approximately 400 vessels strong, received its ceasefire orders early on the morning of the 15th. Surrender in the Pacific cut short new attacks planned to precede actual invasion of the Japanese mainland. Occupation began on the 30th. Guarded by a cover of aircraft and guns of the 3rd Fleet in Tokyo Bay, U.S. Marines and Blue Jackets walked ashore at the Yokosuka Naval Base, south of Yokohama. Brief formalities marked the official acceptance of the base. Lying half sunk a few yards from shore, the once mighty 33,000-ton battleship Nagato was taken over by a prize crew. Submarine pens. One of Japan's main naval bases, Yokosuka had a formidable lineup of amphibian tanks ready for launching. The Jap garrison eagerly showed off its array of weapons. A Baka suicide plane. Meanwhile, 18 miles to the north, transports from Okinawa swarmed in over at Sugi Airfield to prepare for the arrival of the Supreme Allied Commander. Wreckage of Japanese aircraft littered the battered field, setting for one of history's most dramatic moments. Japanese labor completed clearing the strip. At Sugi was American manned and ready, and all awaited the C-54 bearing General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. At 1400, 30th August, the gleaming 4-engined transport brought in the Americans slated to assume control over Japan's affairs. Bataan was remembered. The future had begun. First to greet his chief was Lieutenant General Robert Eichelberger, newly appointed commander of the Tokyo area. MacArthur moved to his next great role aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on the morning of September 2nd. In a 20-minute ceremony conducted topside, in the shadow of the battleship's #2 16-inch gun turret, the fate of Japan was sealed forever. The The 11-man Japanese delegation was photographed by cameramen perched at every vantage point to record the momentous event for posterity. The stage was set. General MacArthur walked from a cabin to open the surrender ceremonies.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. The terms and conditions upon which surrender of the Japanese imperial forces is here to be given and accepted are contained in the instrument of surrender now before you. I now invite the representatives of the Emperor of Japan and the Japanese government and the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters to sign the instrument of surrender at the places indicated.
On behalf of Emperor Hirohito, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for the Japanese government. Japan accepted unconditional surrender according to the provisions of the Potsdam Declaration.
The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan. Will General Wainwright and General Percival step forward and accompany me while I sign?
General Jonathan Wainwright, liberated hero of Corregidor, and British General Arthur Percival, who was forced to surrender Singapore, stood at attention behind MacArthur as he began to write his name with the first of 5 pens. Pen number 1 went to General Wainwright. The second pen was handed to General Percival. The third and fourth were earmarked for the National Archives and West Point. The fifth, Mac kept for himself.
These proceedings are closed.
An empire lost. Territories formerly under Japanese control were divided into 5 surrender regions to expedite capitulation of field commands. All enemy forces in China, as well as Formosa and northern Indochina, to yield to Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Those in Manchuria and northern Korea and Karafuto to the Soviet commander-in-chief of the Far East. Those in Burma, Thailand, southern Indochina, Malaya, the Netherlands Indies, New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Solomons, to Admiral Mountbatten and the Australian commander. Admiral Nimitz accepted the surrender of the troops in the Ryukyus, Bonins, and Mandated Islands, and General MacArthur that of the forces in Japan's home islands, southern Korea, and the Philippines. One of the first field surrenders was on picturesque Cebu Island, central Philippines. Men of the 8th Army's famed Americal Division participated in ceremonies incident to the capitulation of 2,655 bedraggled Japanese holdouts. The commander of the Japanese 35th Army handed over his saber. Swords of Jap officers were piled 6 deep before the show on Cebu was over. But the supreme moment was yet to come in the Philippines. Mist hung over the governor's palace at Baguio, summer capital of the Commonwealth, as Generals Wainwright and Percival, fresh from the Missouri signing, arrived to see an arch foe capitulate. None other than General Yamashita, ferocious tiger of Malaya, who had exacted surrender from Percival at Singapore. Yamashita came out of his hideout in northern Luzon's Caraballo Mountains formally and unconditionally to give up the remnants of his once powerful forces throughout the Philippines. The generals signed on the line. An estimated 40,000 troops were surrendered by Yamashita. Following the 11-minute ceremony, Yamashita was turned over to the MPs as a prisoner of war. And he had a brand new nickname, Gopher of Luzon, hung on him by an anonymous GI. New Bilibid Prison south of Manila was the next address for Yamashita. A nice, quiet cell awaited the fangless tiger. Surrender of bypassed Marcus Island, 1,200 miles southeast of Tokyo. Aboard the U.S. destroyer Bagley, the Japanese Rear Admiral handed over a garrison of 2,500 naval personnel. Wake Island, one of the greater chapters of American heroism, was brought to a close on September 4th, with Old Glory run up to mark our retaking of the island. This was strictly a Marine show. It belonged to them. Colonel Walter Baylor, last man to leave Wake, proudly accepted the honor as first to return. Wreckage found around the island included the original Grumman F-4F Wildcats, part of a Marine squadron of only 12 planes, which helped delay the capture of the Pacific Bastion for 14 days. Singapore, this Gibraltar of the East, overrun in 42 after a swift Japanese advance through the Malay jungles, was restored by seaborne occupation forces. Ships of the British Pacific Fleet off Hong Kong, which had been the first Allied stronghold in the Orient to fall. Surrendered on Christmas Day, 1941, Britain's 32-square-mile colony was the scene of massacres that early showed a shocked world how the Jap meant to rule. In August 1945, the British took over again. Navy combat teams flushed snipers from alleys and streets. Hong Kong had heard the last British shots fired in the war. Nanking. For 8 years since the infamous Japanese rape of the city, this day was anticipated. In the auditorium of the Central Military Academy, former enemy headquarters, the longtime conqueror at last bowed out. By a stroke of a pen, 1 million hated Jap troops in China surrendered to Chiang Kai-shek. 170 miles away in Shanghai, the yoke was lifted amid great rejoicing. The fabulous city of nearly 4 million residents was free for the first time since August 13, 1937. Free with them were approximately 6,000 Allied citizens, including about 1,500 Americans. Southern Korea. Yank troops received a roaring welcome from a people who had been under the Japanese lash for nearly 40 years. Surrender ceremonies were held in the throne room of the governor's palace at the capital city of Seoul. The capitulation of all enemy forces in the American occupation zone was taken by Lieutenant General John Hodge, 24th Corps commander. Outside the palace, the Japanese colors were hauled down. The Hermit Kingdom was free again. Restored to Koreans were the basic freedoms long denied them by the Japs. Throughout the Pacific area and Asia, these were the hours of reckoning and of rescue. Rescue not alone for oppressed populaces, but also for Allied prisoners of war who had endured endless Jap atrocities in hundreds of PW camps. Men from Bataan and Wake, the Aleutians, Marianas, Hong Kong. Men of ships sunk at sea and planes shot down in combat, at long last awakened from a nightmare to learn to laugh once more. The evidence piled up high as camp after camp gave up its surviving prisoners. Well-authenticated stories told of solitary confinement and tortures. The most brutal methods were reserved for those from whom the Japs hoped to force military information. Victims bitterly related incidents of beatings with bats, rifle butts, bamboo rods, and belts. The primitive savagery, the filth and starvation were reminiscent of the death camps at Buchenwald and Belsen. Red Cross packages were nearly all stolen by the guards. Death claimed many of the 200,000 Allied prisoners. But for those who lived to see the day of liberation, there was some revenge. Out of the darkness, back to civilization, came men who had shaken hands with death. For thousands of homes the world over, there was to be cheering news. Owing to the Jap trick of not reporting numerous Allied prisoners, men long believed dead could flash the happy word of their survival. The rescued were moved from the Japanese shore to waiting hospital ships. Their freedom was complete. Their hope for freedom forever for all mankind was voiced by their commander aboard the Missouri when he said,
"It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past. A world founded upon faith and understanding. A world dedicated to the dignity of man and the fulfillment of his most cherished wish for freedom, tolerance, and justice."